Black soldiers marched through Tokyo, 1945, and what Japanese citizens did defied all propaganda. The march into history. The morning mist hung heavy over the ruins of Tokyo, as the boots of the 42nd Regimental Combat Team echoed through the devastated streets. Among them marched Sergeant Robert Big Bob Washington, his massive frame cutting an imposing figure against the backdrop of a city brought to its knees. At 6'4" and weighing nearly 250 pounds, Big Bob had earned his nickname not just from his physical stature, but from his larger-than-life presence that commanded respect from both his fellow soldiers and the enemies he'd faced across the Pacific. The date was September 15, 1945, just 2 weeks after Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri. The war was over, but for Big Bob and his brothers in arms, the real test was just beginning. They were about to enter a city where propaganda had painted them as demons, where citizens had been told that American soldiers, particularly black soldiers, were savage beasts who would show no mercy. Big Bob adjusted his rifle strap and glanced at the faces of his squad. There was Private Johnson from Detroit, barely 19 but aged beyond his years by the horrors of Iwo Jima. Corporal Martinez from Los Angeles, whose family had been interned while he fought for the very country that had imprisoned them, and dozens of others, each carrying their own stories of sacrifice and service. "Remember, boys," Big Bob called out in his deep, resonant voice that had guided them through countless battles, "we're not conquerors today, we're liberators. These people have been fed lies about us for years. Today we show them who we really are." The column moved deeper into the city, past buildings reduced to skeletal frames and streets lined with rubble. The silence was deafening, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a population holding its collective breath. Behind shattered windows and in doorways, Big Bob could see them, Japanese civilians, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The propaganda machine had done its work well. For years, Japanese citizens had been told that American forces, especially black soldiers, were barbaric monsters who would rape, pillage, and destroy everything in their path. Children had been taught to fear the very sight of these men, and many families had prepared for the worst when news of the surrender reached them. But as Big Bob's unit marched through the Shibuya district, something unexpected began to happen. An elderly Japanese man, his clothes tattered but his dignity intact, stepped out from behind a pile of debris. He bowed deeply to the passing soldiers, his weathered hands trembling not with fear but with what appeared to be gratitude. If you're finding this story as compelling as I am, please hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started with Big Bob's incredible journey through post-war Tokyo. Big Bob raised his hand, signaling for the column to halt. He approached the elderly man slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The man looked up, and Big Bob saw something in his eyes that defied everything the propaganda had promised. There was no hatred, no terror. Instead there was relief, and perhaps even hope. "Konnichiwa," Big Bob said, using one of the few Japanese words he'd learned during the long voyage across the Pacific. The old man's eyes widened in surprise. Here was this imposing black soldier, this supposed monster from American propaganda, greeting him with respect and attempting to speak his language. The old man responded with a flood of Japanese that Big Bob couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was gratitude, pure, overwhelming gratitude. Through gestures and broken English, the man managed to convey that he had lost 3 sons in the war, that his city lay in ruins, and that he had expected the worst from the occupying force. Instead, he found himself face to face with men who showed him dignity and respect. Word of this encounter spread quickly through the ranks and into the surrounding neighborhood. Other civilians began to emerge from their hiding places, drawn by curiosity and the growing realization that these soldiers were nothing like what they had been told to expect. A young Japanese woman, clutching a small child to her chest, approached Big Bob's position. She had been widowed in the bombing of Hiroshima, and had fled to Tokyo with nothing but the clothes on her back and her infant daughter. The propaganda had told her that black soldiers were particularly brutal toward women and children, but desperation had driven her from her hiding place. Big Bob noticed her hesitation and slowly removed his helmet, revealing his kind eyes and gentle smile. He reached into his pack and pulled out a chocolate bar, part of his own rations, and offered it to the child. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she realized that this monster was showing kindness to her daughter. The scene was repeated throughout the district as more civilians emerged. Big Bob's men, following their sergeant's example, began sharing their rations with hungry families, helping to clear debris from the streets, and treating the Japanese people with a respect that flew in the face of everything the propaganda had predicted. As the day wore on, Big Bob found himself reflecting on the power of propaganda and the danger of dehumanizing an enemy. These Japanese civilians were not the fanatical monsters that American propaganda had sometimes portrayed them as, just as he and his men were not the savage beasts that Japanese propaganda had claimed them to be. They were all human beings, caught in the machinery of war, trying to survive and find meaning in the aftermath of unimaginable destruction. Big Bob had established a temporary command post in what remained of a school building, its walls scarred by shrapnel but still standing as a testament to human resilience. As dawn broke over Tokyo, he could see more civilians venturing out, their initial terror slowly giving way to cautious curiosity. The transformation was remarkable. Where the first day had been marked by fearful glances and hesitant approaches, the second day brought something approaching normalcy. Japanese families began to line the streets, not to protest or resist, but to watch these American soldiers with growing fascination. Big Bob noticed a group of Japanese children peering around a corner, their eyes wide with wonder rather than fear. Among them was a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his clothes patched and repatched, but his spirit unbroken. The child reminded Big Bob of his own nephew back in Alabama, and he felt a pang of homesickness mixed with protective instinct. "Private Johnson," Big Bob called to his youngest soldier, "you still got any of that candy from your care package?" Johnson grinned and reached into his pack, pulling out a handful of wrapped sweets that his mother had sent from Detroit. "Sure do, Sarge. What you got in mind? Let's see if we can make some friends." Big Bob approached the group of children slowly, his massive frame somehow managing to appear non-threatening. He knelt down to their level, making himself smaller, less imposing. The children watched with fascination as this giant of a man carefully unwrapped a piece of candy and offered it to the youngest child, a little girl with pigtails who couldn't have been more than 5. The girl looked to the older boy for guidance. He stepped forward, clearly the leader of their small group, and studied Big Bob's face intently. What he saw there must have satisfied him, because he nodded to the little girl, who tentatively reached out and took the candy. The moment she tasted it, her face lit up with pure joy. She had probably never tasted anything so sweet in her young life, having grown up during the harsh rationing of wartime Japan. Her delight was infectious, and soon all the children were crowding around Big Bob and his men, chattering excitedly in Japanese. This incredible moment of human connection is exactly why I love sharing these untold stories of history. If you're enjoying this journey with Big Bob, please give this video a like and let me know in the comments what you think about these unexpected encounters. But it wasn't just the children who were beginning to see these soldiers differently. Japanese adults, particularly the women who had lost husbands and sons in the war, began to observe how gently these supposedly savage men treated their children. They watched as Big Bob helped an elderly woman carry water from a well, as Corporal Martinez used his engineering skills to help repair a damaged roof, and as Private Johnson shared his medical knowledge to treat a child's infected wound. One woman, Miss Tanaka, had lost her husband at Guadalcanal and her eldest son in the Philippines. She had been prepared to die rather than face the humiliation she expected from the occupying forces. But as she watched Big Bob playing with the neighborhood children, teaching them simple English words while trying to learn Japanese phrases in return, she began to question everything she had been told. "Sergeant Washington," she said in halting English, approaching him during a quiet moment. Big Bob was surprised. It was the first time a Japanese adult had addressed him directly by name. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, standing and removing his cap in a gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed. "My husband, he fight your soldiers, he die in Pacific. I think I hate you." Her English was broken, but her meaning was clear. "But you are not what they tell us. You are, kind man." Big Bob felt the weight of her word. Here was a woman who had every reason to hate him and everything he represented, yet she was reaching across the divide of war and propaganda to acknowledge his humanity. It was a moment that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I'm sorry for your loss. Your husband was a brave man, fighting for what he believed in. We may have been enemies then, but we don't have to be enemies now. Mrs. Tanaka nodded, tears streaming down her face. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small origami crane, folded from a piece of newspaper. She pressed it into Big Bob's massive hand. For peace, she said simply. The gesture spread throughout the neighborhood. Other women began approaching the soldiers, not with fear or hatred, but with small gifts, origami figures, simple drawings, flowers picked from the ruins of their garden. Each gift was a rejection of the propaganda that had painted these men as monsters, a small act of rebellion against the hatred that war had tried to instill. By evening, something extraordinary had happened. The Japanese civilians in this district were no longer hiding from the American soldiers, they were actively seeking them out, offering help, sharing what little food they had, and beginning to build the foundations of an unlikely friendship. Big Bob stood on the steps of the school building, looking out over a scene that would have been unimaginable just days before. Japanese children were playing games with American soldiers, their laughter echoing through streets that had known only the sounds of war for so long. Adults were working alongside the occupying forces to clear debris and begin the long process of rebuilding. The propaganda had failed. On both sides, the carefully constructed images of the enemy as inhuman monsters were crumbling in the face of actual human contact. Big Bob realized that he was witnessing something historic, not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a peace built on mutual respect and understanding rather than conquest and submission. Word of the extraordinary scenes in Big Bob's district began to spread throughout Tokyo like wildfire. Japanese radio, still operating under American oversight, began reporting on the unexpected behavior of the occupying force. But it wasn't just official channels carrying the news, it was spreading through the underground network of whispered conversations, shared experiences, and first-hand accounts that had sustained the Japanese people through the darkest days of the war. By the third day, Big Bob found himself at the center of something much larger than a simple military occupation. Delegations of Japanese civilians from other districts began arriving, curious to see for themselves these soldiers who defied every stereotype they had been taught to believe. Among them was Dr. Hiroshi Yamamoto, a former military physician who had treated Japanese soldiers throughout the Pacific Campaign. He had seen the aftermath of battles against American forces, had heard the stories of captured soldiers, and had been thoroughly convinced that the enemy was capable of unspeakable cruelty. Yet here he stood, watching Big Bob carefully tend to a Japanese child's scraped knee with the same gentle attention he might give to one of his own men. This is not possible, Dr. Yamamoto murmured to himself in Japanese, but Big Bob's keen ears caught the words. What's not possible? Big Bob asked, having learned that the man was a physician from the Red Cross armband he wore. Dr. Yamamoto started, surprised that the American soldier had understood his comment. You speak Japanese? Just a few words, Big Bob admitted with a smile, but I'm learning. Your people are good teachers. The doctor studied Big Bob's face, searching for some sign of deception or hidden cruelty. What he found instead was genuine warmth and intelligence that challenged every preconception he had held. The propaganda, Yamamoto said slowly, it told us that American soldiers, especially soldiers like you, would be brutal, savage, without honor. Big Bob nodded thoughtfully. Our propaganda said similar things about your people, that you were all fanatics who would fight to the death, who had no regard for human life. Funny how wrong propaganda can be when you actually meet the people it's talking about. This conversation marked a turning point. Yamamoto began working alongside the American medics, sharing his knowledge of local diseases, and helping to treat both American soldiers and Japanese civilians. His presence lent credibility to the growing movement of cooperation, and other Japanese professionals began to emerge from hiding. The way these former enemies came together is absolutely incredible. If you're as amazed by this story as I am, please subscribe to see more untold stories from history that challenge everything we think we know about war and peace. A former Japanese engineer named Kenji Nakamura approached Big Bob with a proposal. The city's water system had been severely damaged by bombing, and many neighborhoods were without clean water. Nakamura had the expertise to help repair it, but he needed materials and manpower. Could the American forces assist? Big Bob didn't hesitate. Within hours, he had organized work crews of both American soldiers and Japanese civilians, working side by side to restore one of the city's most essential services. The sight of former enemies laboring together for the common good drew crowds of onlookers. many of whom joined in the effort. As they worked, barriers continued to fall. Language differences became opportunities for learning rather than sources of frustration. American soldiers taught English words while learning Japanese phrases. Cultural differences became sources of curiosity rather than suspicion. Big Bob found himself fascinated by Japanese concepts of honor and respect, while Japanese workers were impressed by the Americans' pragmatic problem-solving approach. One evening, as the work crews took a break, an elderly Japanese man named Mr. Sato approached Big Bob with a question that had been weighing on his mind. "Sergeant Washington," he said through Dr. Yamamoto, who had become an unofficial translator, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course, sir. You have shown us great kindness, you and your men, but we were told that American soldiers, particularly black soldiers, were treated poorly in your own country. Is this true?" The question hit Big Bob like a physical blow. It was true. He and his men had faced discrimination and segregation in their own military, had been denied opportunities and recognition that their white counterparts took for granted. They had fought bravely for a country that didn't always treat them as full citizens. Big Bob was quiet for a long moment, considering his response. Finally, he spoke with characteristic honesty. "Mr. Sato, that's a complicated question. Yes, we face challenges back home. Yes, we're not always treated equally, but that doesn't change our duty as soldiers, and it doesn't change our responsibility as human beings to treat others with dignity and respect." Dr. Yamamoto translated, and Mr. Sato's eyes widened with understanding. Here were men who had been denied full equality in their own society, yet they showed no bitterness toward their former enemies. Instead, they demonstrated a nobility of spirit that transcended the prejudices of both nations. The conversation sparked a deeper dialogue about justice, equality, and the nature of patriotism. Japanese civilians who had been taught that America was a land of freedom and equality were surprised to learn about the struggles faced by Black Americans. American soldiers, in turn, learned about the rigid social hierarchies and pressures that had shaped Japanese society. These discussions, held around campfires in the ruins of Tokyo, became a form of cultural exchange that no government had planned or anticipated. They were organic, honest conversations between people who had been enemies just weeks before, but who were now discovering their shared humanity. As the third day drew to a close, Big Bob reflected on how much had changed. The fear and suspicion that had marked their arrival had been replaced by something approaching friendship. Children who had once hidden from the sight of American soldiers now ran to greet them. Adults who had expected brutality found instead partners in the difficult work of rebuilding their shattered city. But perhaps most importantly, both sides had learned that propaganda, no matter how sophisticated or pervasive, could not withstand the power of direct human contact. When people met as individuals rather than as representatives of opposing ideologies, when they worked together toward common goals, the artificial barriers of hatred and fear simply melted away. 2 weeks had passed since Big Bob's unit first marched into Tokyo, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. What had begun as a military occupation had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of warfare, a genuine partnership between former enemies based on mutual respect and shared humanity. The success of Big Bob's district had not gone unnoticed by higher command. General MacArthur himself had received reports of the extraordinary cooperation between American forces and Japanese civilians, and he had dispatched observers to document what was happening. What they found challenged every assumption about post-war occupation and reconstruction. The model that Big Bob and his men had inadvertently created was being studied and replicated throughout Japan. Other units were being instructed to follow their example, to treat Japanese civilians not as conquered subjects, but as partners in rebuilding. The rigid military protocols that typically governed occupation forces were being relaxed in favor of the more human approach that had proven so effective. But for Big Bob, the real measure of success wasn't in official reports or commendations, it was in the faces of the people around him. Mrs. Tanaka, the widow who had first approached him with her origami crane, had become a liaison between the American forces and the local community. Dr. Yamamoto was working full-time with American medics, and his collaboration had already saved dozens of lives. The children who had once feared the sight of American soldiers now competed for the chance to help with daily tasks and practice their English. On this particular morning, Big Bob was supervising the construction of a new community center that would serve both American personnel and Japanese civilians. The building was rising from the ruins of what had once been a military recruitment office, a symbolic transformation that wasn't lost on anyone involved in the project. Sergeant Washington, called Private Johnson, who was working alongside Kenji Nakamura to install electrical wiring, You need to see this. Big Bob walked over to where Johnson was pointing. Carved into one of the wooden support beams, someone had inscribed a message in both English and Japanese: enemies in war, friends in peace, September 9. Who did this? Big Bob asked. Nakamura smiled and pointed to a group of Japanese and American workers who were pretending to be busy with their tasks while stealing glances at Big Bob's reaction. It was, how you say, group effort. We all agree, this is important to remember. Big Bob felt a lump forming in his throat. These people, who had every reason to harbor resentment and hatred, had instead chosen to commemorate the friendship that had grown from the ashes of war. It was a testament to the power of human decency to overcome even the deepest division. This moment gives me chills every time I think about it. The power of human connection to overcome even the deepest hatred is just incredible. If this story is touching your heart the way it's touching mine, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of hope. As the day progressed, Big Bob found himself thinking about the broader implications of what they had accomplished. The propaganda machines of both nations had spent years dehumanizing the enemy, creating images of monsters and savages that justified the brutality of war. But when those carefully constructed lies came face to face with reality, when actual human beings met and interacted, the propaganda simply couldn't survive. The lesson was profound and universal. Hatred, fear and prejudice thrived in the absence of genuine human contact. They fed on ignorance, on stereotypes, on the comfortable distance that allowed people to see others as less than human. But when that distance was bridged, when people met as individuals rather than as representatives of opposing groups, understanding became possible. That evening, the community gathered for what had become a daily tradition, a shared meal prepared by both American cooks and Japanese families. The food was simple, often just rice and vegetables supplemented by American rations, but the symbolism was powerful. Former enemies breaking bread together, sharing stories, learning from each other. Big Bob found himself seated next to Mr. Sato, the elderly man who had questioned him about racial inequality in America. Through Yamamoto's translation, they had continued their conversations about justice, equality, and the nature of human dignity. Sergeant Washington, Mr. Sato said, I have been thinking about our previous conversations, about the struggles your people face in America. Yes, I think perhaps we are not so different, your people and mine. We have both known what it is to be seen as less than fully human. Perhaps that is why you understand us so well. The observation was startling in its insight. Big Bob had never considered it from that perspective, but Mr. Sato was right. The experience of being marginalized, of being judged by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character, had given him a unique empathy for others who had been dehumanized by prejudice and propaganda. Maybe that's true, Big Bob replied thoughtfully. Maybe it takes someone who's been on the receiving end of hatred to really understand how wrong it is. As the meal concluded and people began to drift back to their homes and quarters, Big Bob stood and addressed the gathering. Dr. Yamamoto translated his words into Japanese. Friends, he began 2 weeks ago, we came here as occupying forces. You saw us as enemies, as the monsters your government had told you we were. We saw you as a conquered people, as the fanatics our government had told us you were. But something amazing has happened here. We've learned to see each other as human beings. He paused, looking around at the faces, American and Japanese, young and old, all united by their shared experience of the past 2 weeks. What we've built here isn't just about reconstruction of buildings or infrastructure. We've reconstructed something more important. We've rebuilt trust between people who were taught to hate each other. We've proven that propaganda can't survive contact with reality, that hatred can't withstand the power of human kindness. The applause that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt, but Big Bob wasn't finished. I want you all to remember this moment, this feeling, because someday, you're going to encounter people who try to tell you that others are your enemies because of their race, their religion, their nationality, or their belief. When that happens, I want you to remember what we've learned here, that every person is an individual, that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, and that the only way to truly know someone is to take the time to understand them. As we reach the end of Big Bob's incredible story, I want you to think about how this message applies to our world today. If you found this story as powerful as I did, please subscribe to this channel. We have so many more untold stories that challenge our assumptions and remind us of our shared humanity. The weeks that followed saw the formalization of many of the innovations that had emerged organically in Big Bob's district. The community center became a model for similar facilities throughout Japan.
the collaborative approach to reconstruction was adopted as official policy. The relationships that had been forged between American personnel and Japanese civilians became the foundation for a lasting friendship between the two nations. But perhaps most importantly, the individuals who had participated in this extraordinary experiment carried its lessons with them for the rest of their lives. They had learned that propaganda was powerless against personal experience, that hatred could not survive genuine human contact, and that the courage to reach across divides could transform enemies into friends. Big Bob returned to the United States a changed man. The discrimination he faced as a black soldier in a segregated military seemed even more senseless after his experience in Japan, where he had been judged by his actions rather than his appearance. He became an advocate for civil rights, drawing on his experience in Tokyo to argue that prejudice was a learned behavior that could be unlearned through education and contact. Many of the Japanese civilians he had worked with went on to become leaders in their communities, carrying forward the lessons of cooperation and mutual respect they had learned during those crucial weeks, and they taught their children and grandchildren that former enemies could become friends, that understanding was always possible when people approached each other with open hearts and minds. The story of Big Bob and his unit in Tokyo became a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, the light of human decency could shine through. It proved that propaganda, no matter how pervasive or convincing, could not withstand the simple truth of human-to-human contact, and it demonstrated that the choice between hatred and understanding, between fear and friendship, was always available to those brave enough to reach across the divide. In a world that often seems divided by insurmountable differences, the legacy of those weeks in Tokyo in 1945 remains as relevant as ever. It reminds us that behind every stereotype is an individual, behind every enemy is a human being, and behind every conflict is the possibility of peace, if we have the courage to see each other clearly and the wisdom to choose understanding over hatred. The march of Big Bob and his men through Tokyo had ended, but their real journey, the journey toward a more understanding and compassionate world, was just beginning. This story shows us that even in the aftermath of the most devastating war in human history, ordinary people had the power to choose hope over hatred, understanding over prejudice. If Big Bob's story has inspired you the way it has inspired me, please make sure to subscribe to this channel for more incredible untold stories from history, and let me know in the comments what moments in your own life have challenged your assumptions about others. I read every comment and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, remember that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about, and a little kindness can change the world.